We now welcome Arun Kumar, General Manager for Supply Chain Management at telecoms operator MTN Group. Arun will discuss approaches to improving supply chain agility by using advanced data analytics for forecasting. Over to you, Arun.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Arun. I work for MTN, South African telecom operator operating in 21 countries. Today, I will be talking to you about our experience with the implementation of a global trade management application and how it has helped us build supply chain resilience, especially during the COVID times. So it's more of a case study. I would give you a bit of our journey, and any questions you may have, I would answer towards the end of it. Now, the first thing that people are going to have is, questions is, okay, who is MTN and why is MTN here in this region? MTN is a top 10 mobile operator. We operate out of South Africa, and we operate in 21 countries in Middle East and Africa. So now from a statistics perspective, you can see on the right-hand side that we are the top 10 mobile operator. We are Africa's #1 brand. We have over 273 million subscribers. At any given time, we carry inventory worth $1 billion. We have over 40 million mobile money subscribers. So you could almost call us like a bank, if you will. And from a sourcing and supply chain and procurement perspective, we run over 5,000 sourcing events. So that's the kind of scale that we operate in. So approximately, we spend around $12 billion annually with over 15,000 suppliers spread across, I use the word 19 countries here because that's the implementation scope that I'm going to be talking to you about. We have over 3,200 global contracts managed by 200 procurement and supply chain professionals. And end of the day, we deliver over $2 billion in savings. Now, before I even get into the digitization journey of MTN and global sourcing and supply chain, the first thing to kind of look at and address is for anyone who did not know what supply chain management was. After COVID, supply chain management has become something important. So you would hear additional stories like supply chain resilience, supply chain risk management, and everything else. But if someone didn't care about supply chain management before, now they care about it. So think of supply chain management like, I would kind of de-glamorize it for a second. Supply chain management is like the plumbing that's in your house. Now, if the plumbing works, no one really cares about thanking the plumbing team that everything is going well. Thank you very much. But when COVID came in, it's literally like all the pipes burst loose. And now suddenly supply chain has to come and make sure that everything works. You have a house to live in. So that's literally how supply chain has kind of had to reinvent itself. And the best thing that we can actually look forward to is that supply chain has now got a seat at the table. And when I say seat at the table, I'm talking at the most highest level of executive positions. So that's the positive spin to look at when you want to look at the impact of COVID and why supply chain is slowly getting recognized as some key differentiator. Now, if I were to talk about the digitization of MTN, we started our digitization journey much before COVID really hit us. So our journey has been predominantly, we are driving it with the Oracle Cloud Platform. We implemented the global trade management application back in 2019 with no view that this is what was going to happen, because no one could have predicted that COVID and how the supply chain would have impacted, we would have even known anything as to how deep it would go. But what we had done at that time, it seemed like a pipe dream. So we wanted to build a complete trade management application covering all our operations. And at the same time, we realized that from a supply chain perspective, I need to give you a scale of operations. When we look at MTN as a group, our landed costs sometimes eats up nearly 60% of our budget because of the kind of equipments we move. It's because we are a telecom operator. Therefore, global trade management became that much important because that was a differentiator for us when it comes to how we keep the costs low, how we ensure that the business runs as normal. Along with that, we did a few other implementations. I will just leave them. I'll leave them on the screen. But basically, what we have done with global trade management is we realized that global trade management allows you to capture transactions. But what it really does not give you is looking at advanced analytics, kind of integrating into the vendor supply chains and things like that. So that's when we said, okay, we need to scale it up. We need to scale up the entire global trade management implementation itself. Now, typically what we did in global trade management was we would capture everything to do with the orders, with the volumes, with the costs, with the duties, with the clearing fees, every little thing that any supply chain expert typically captures when it comes to managing landed costs, right? Now, along with that, we realized that okay, hold on, this is only giving us post the activity. How do we kind of make this thing a little better? And that's what I want to talk to you about. And I will kind of give you examples on how it really helped us post-COVID, post the pandemic. Just quickly rush through the landscape of our solutions. As you can see, some of you may recognize most of the flags, but it's like a geography lesson for all of us, right? We operate in 21 countries, some of the toughest markets out there. So we operate in places like Syria, Yemen as well, along with operating in some of our largest markets like Nigeria, Iran, South Africa, of course, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. Now, as I mentioned from the beginning, the digitization journey for supply chain has been very important from the time the global sourcing and supply chain function was set up in Dubai. So it started in 2012, our journey. And then we've said that we can't just be stuck to the traditional ways of looking at supply chain management. We really need to scale up and provide actionable insights to the business. So with that, there were various other elements, of course, but I will focus purely on the global trade management piece. Now, essentially, if I look at my key operating highlights, right? So at any given time, we move around 4,000 to 5,000 containers. I understand from the scale of operations that most of you operate in, 5,000 containers is nothing much. But the value of cargo that we move in is that high. So we pay a little over $250 million just in customs duties alone. And even our local clearing fees goes over $10 million a year. So therefore, it is that much of a differentiator and it's that important for us, right? Now, typically what we did as part of our global trade management application was, first of all, we said we need to know the entire landed cost. We need to break down to see what the costs are, what the lead times are, how long is it taking for us to ship from point A to point B, take into account historical statistics to find out, okay, how long did it take before, how much will it take in the future based on the time of year, etc. Now, so the cost elements was the first thing that we focused on. And then once it gets delivered, we started looking at, okay, what about the clearing times? What is the freight cost per kilogram? What are the elements that we look at when it comes to container charges? Because as I was telling you, there are 21 ports, more than 21 ports that we have to pull stuff into. Not necessarily ports, some of them are landlocked countries. So we'll have to, for example, in Uganda, we don't ship it in because it's landlocked. We ship it into Mombasa, and from there, a truck takes it in. Therefore, we have to look at all these kind of combinations to see, okay, capture everything, look at all the freight modes that are there in between, look at the kind of products that are being transferred, and then arrive at historical transaction views on lead times, etc., and the landed cost based on the HS codes and other elements. Now, we looked at it, and that was an easy thing to look at, okay, because we built 2 to 3 years of historical data, and then we were easily able to migrate that into Oracle. But what we started realizing was we were incurring a lot of additional costs when we were looking at the freight. So that's when we integrated into a third-party applications to, or at least from a data perspective, to look at what are the freight benchmark rates for specific port pairs. So we started plugging that in to see, okay, where is the threshold going up or below plus or minus 5% as an example. So we built that element in. Then the entire lead time analytics, because the kind of products we move in, some of them are made to order. Therefore, our lead times could go anywhere from 2 to 6 months, depending on the market that we want to pull it in. So the lead time analytics had to be broken down by vendor, broken down by product, and it has to be actuals, not what vendors commit to us, because we have to take into account that some of our port operations are not really the most easiest. So I would, if I were to compare JAFSA would probably allow us to clear stuff on the same day. Whereas in most of our operations, sometimes it takes even 20 days, 30 days, sometimes even 2 months to clear our consignments. So we have to look at that entire lead time analytics end to end. And finally, regulatory compliance. Because of the kind of cargo we move in, we are by default connected to the local ministries wherever they are. Just like how Etisalat would be connecting to the Telecom Regulatory Authority here, or DO would. We have to do the same thing in all our other operations. So we have to have track of all our compliance and legal documents, customs duties at a transaction level to know what is being captured, what is being managed. Now, with that in mind, we built all that, and then we said, okay, we need to connect to the other things. So now these are the kind of insights I'll be talking of, and I'll start from the first thing. The first thing, as I said, was we get to have a complete view on the complete landed cost. We have a freight charge per kilogram. We built it for all our 19 operations. So therefore, you could go as a group, we can look at it from a high level view. Our operating companies can look at it at a more granular view, see where the thresholds are going higher or below. They can start looking at their lead times by vendors, and also looking at the kind of modes that they want to do, pull it in. Sometimes they can expedite it and manage that particular part of the lead time. So they have the entire historical data. But again, it's historical, right? And again, it gives the lead times by mode, by country. But that's when we realized that, listen, this is almost post the activity. So what do we do next? What do we do better? So we realized that it's not enough to just have an MTN view on it. We spoke to 4 of our biggest vendors, partners, operating in China and of course in Europe. And we integrated our global trade management application into their platform. So literally we start creating the orders, and we actually know exactly at what stage of manufacturing or what stage of shipping, what stage of packaging, etc. it is there within the supply chain. Now this we had done before COVID, right? So we started building it before COVID. Now what happened was, because once COVID hit, and this is where MTN's entire operating model changed. And this is where I want to give you a telco perspective on what happened within the business and how we reacted to it. First of all, across the board, like what happened in the UAE and other markets, the capital envelope was cut down. Most of the big projects were canceled. But end of the day, you have to remember, we are a telecom operator. Now in Africa, most of the consumers, they connect to the internet not via fiber, but via mobile. Therefore, our network started seeing such a spike in the business, in the traffic. And we are now suddenly looking at a 50% spike in traffic, which means the network capacity had to be increased. So the order profile with all our vendors changed dramatically within just 2 months. While projects were being cut, we had to increase the resilience part of the business. At the same time, we had to ensure that our network was sustainable for 12 months, at least when it comes to making sure that the spares were available, because we are talking about entire countries that we are covering, right? Imagine the country the size of Nigeria, which has to have full coverage because everyone is connected to the internet using our mobile network. We are mostly number 1 or number 2 in most of these markets. And we had to build that. Now, what that meant was our supply chain control tower that we had built at that time, just to know about orders, etc., it completely got rejigged. And now we could actually look at all our COVID-based orders and forecasts that are coming in and start looking at, okay, where within the supply chain, which is the market that is not going to be managing the capacity? Where is it that I'm going to run out of spares? We could actually start looking at data in such a way. Now, my colleague earlier, Andrew Savage, was talking about how the data and AI and elements are actually coming into play. Now, we looked at it the same way and we said, hold on, this data is there. Now, using the same data, which we thought we would use for our traditional implementation, we can completely start predicting where things are going to go wrong, if you will, right? Where goods could still arrive on the port, but you could still not clear it. And because we had that, along with that, we had a freight benchmark integration. So we could connect our freight rates, actuals, against the benchmark rates and see where the vendors or the shipping lines are going above or below the threshold. And because of that, we could see, okay, are we bringing it at the right cost, even though it is mission critical? And because the repository of all the clearing documents were there, we had all the data in place. So in case there was any inspection or any element that was required within a country, they could just quickly go into the platform and pick that up. And as a group, we built this massive supply chain control tower dashboard that gives us complete visibility on our entire supply chain at any given time. I won't say it is completely real time, only because our integration into our vendors' manufacturing systems is not real time. It has to be almost there's probably a week's delay sometimes when we look at the actual orders and statuses. And then we are able to rejig the fulfillment cycle to look at various dates, not just the manufacturing till when it lands, but then starting to look at patterns within, okay, maybe this country has an issue with the clearing. Therefore, we are not able to pull it within 10 days. Maybe it's taking longer. So we started building that. And then when we put this entire digital platform out there, so it was almost like our digitization journey that we started back in 2012 originally and 2019 with the global trade management application started delivering results that we were not originally expecting from it, right? So the COVID-19 thing, when the pandemic hit us, we could actually react much more faster. We could go to our executive committees and give them actionable insights, tell them these are the areas where we are going to have problems. And literally, as part of the international supply chain division within MTN Group, we had a seat at the table. Our executives would sit there at the table and literally challenge the business to talk about how our supply chain was reacting to it. We started looking at port closures. We started looking at backward supply chain integrations to see, we conducted endless surveys with our suppliers to see where their original supply chains were getting affected, meaning where their component supply chain was getting affected. So ultimately, this resulted in us delivering actual value to the business. And with that, I'm going to close the session, and I'm going to leave it to Rob to coordinate the questions. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Arun. And that was actually that was a very, very interesting discussion, very interesting insight. So what I found particularly interesting there is you've gone from, I guess what you now have is you have tangible evidence for your decision making. And that tangible evidence is linked directly to data that you can then take to, that if you're asked for evidence from, say, your board, you're able to present it very easily and they can understand it, correct?
Pretty much, yes. So like people keep talking about data as the new oil, etc. I think for us, data has become the new air. We needed to breathe, right? Now, what that gave us was, because when previously supply chain would be seen as a support function, now we are seen as a much more strategic and an enabling function to look at it and say that, listen, we are not just going to listen to you guys to just execute what you want, but we are actually going to challenge you on some of these elements and give you evidence to that effect, that if you plan something poorly, this is the ripple effect of it. So that, because ultimately this resulted in a massive data lake for us. And because our journey had started much earlier, we could build these insights, and we continue to build insights. So our journey has not stopped. Every day that my team is sitting at the back, and then they continue to build additional insights coming out of the data that we already have. And we have the evidence to back up our story. So we are no more in a situation where we have to defend our position. Instead, we have evidence, and there you go, guys. This is the truth. This is reality. Data does not lie. Yes, data can be made to lie, but we don't have data that lies. So that's where we are with this journey.
So another thing I found very interesting is, I mean, your dashboard. Now, I don't know if what you were showing on that dashboard is the view that, say, your users get, but you have a dashboard that really gives, in a very simple way, information that people can track and see and understand. And then they can take and use that for decision making. And I found it very interesting that you were saying, for instance, with shipping, you used it to try and understand when the best time was for shipping. And has that been enacted now? Are you now looking at other areas where you can use this data to look for, I don't know, the equivalence of the best time, the best price?
Yeah. So interesting question, Rob. And unfortunately, it's not a very straightforward answer from my side, but I'll try to kind of jig it in. So yes, the initial startup was always around looking at the kind of port pairs that were making sense and giving insights to our local operating teams to tell them, guys, this is the best kind of port pair to pull it in. This is the typical lead time you're going to encounter during this month because of monsoon or whatever. Your local ports have clearing issues, therefore you're going to have delays. We could give that insights. But that, I mean, we have that part of it we have done. We also connected to looking at the freight benchmark rates, etc. But where we are now taking it a little beyond is to say, okay, traditionally people will look at just the LCL and FCL kind of view, but ours, we don't really care that much about that because we're trying to pull in full containers. But then we are also looking at the air shipments, right? We're trying to build an analytics into the actual air shipments, the kind of weight, the charges that we are paying based on weights, etc. Where we are now working on a use case to scale it up beyond is looking at supply chain and looking at our entire MTNs capitalization and revenue targets. Meaning, if I can give you an example, is typically, let's say I'm building a site in a region, building a 5G site network in a region. Now, that has been part of the project plan. And therefore, someone is expecting, let's say, a 30% uptick in revenue in that region. Now, looking at the supply chain perspective, I'm looking at an order, and I'm seeing that an order is supposed to be delivered in Jan, but I know based on history and statistics, and looking at the nature of the order, and because of the vendor's confirmation as well, I know an order is going to be delayed by 2 months. We actually want to predict that for those 2 months, you're going to take a revenue hit and start looking at a cash loss, if you will, just to say that you had planned for something, you assume that you're going to start booking revenue in Jan. So we are now going beyond supply chain and start looking at revenue and other areas that we can impact. So every day we get some new use case or the other that we are scaling up from.
So this is very much, I mean, you mentioned Andrew, and I was moderating the panel discussion that Andrew was on, and that panel did talk about the ability of using this type of data for forecasting. And this is exactly what you're talking about. It's now enabling you to look forwards and actually make decisions that help, well, if nothing else, at crude level, help save the company money.
Yeah, exactly. So Andrew and I work very closely together. So what we are building is this huge data lake, right? So we have now the next phase of our operations is to look at more additional AI and ML use cases on building the additional focus. Now, unfortunately, as part of this presentation, because we focus just on global trade management, I didn't touch upon our demand forecasting implementation, which we have implemented in 5 countries. where we look at the entire historical sales, historical forecast, etc., and then predict where you need to plan order. So that's maybe a case study for another day where we could talk about it. So we have that use case also built in within the system. And what we have done is now we have this multiple data lakes, right? So we are trying to connect them all to see, and we are actually now trying to build a pattern of that into the actual budgeting cycle. So we also have a budgeting implementation. Our entire group plans its budget the same way. And we have the budget forecast coming in, along with that, as a result, the revenue forecast. And then we are trying to tie it into our global trade management application to see, okay, guys, where is it? Is it really possible? Are we actually going to meet these targets? So I think the best way to summarize it, I think supply chain is, at least in our organization, is now seen as an essential part of the business and not a necessary evil as some of the other organizations think. We are seen as differentiators to the business.
Thank you, Arun. That was a really fascinating presentation. I loved the amount of data that you supplied there to really explain how it was being used and how it was changing the way that your business operates. Our next presentation in this track will be at 3 p.m., so in about 10 minutes. It will look at building resilience in supply chain during a lockdown and be given by Hani Al-Say from STC. At 5 to 3 UAE time in the new supplier relationship management track is a talk on next level supplier risk management. Thank you.